Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I think when you're a journalist, it pays to be humble when you look at prophecy about the future of journalism. Back at The Economist in 2006, shortly after I became that magazine's editor, we published a cover which read, "Who killed the newspaper?" And it was written like a ransom demand, and it became a staple of conferences like this. Whenever people wanted to talk about the way that journalism was in trouble, they would produce this cover. And so when newspapers sadly went bankrupt, when the advertising ran out, I at least had the compensation of feeling that we had been somewhat prophetic. But was it actually fair? The same year that headline came out, just 2 weeks after I became editor of The Economist, a small company called Twitter was set up. It is now arguably the world's biggest newspaper, with 400 million daily readers. Or look around at the quality press at the moment. The New York Times just announced it has 3 million digital subscribers and is aiming for 10. Looking back, I would argue, the problem was not the internet. It was the way that our industry responded to the internet, and especially the slightly mad approach that giving away content for free was a good idea. Now that is being reversed, and people are making money and hiring journalists again. So technology, I think, has always changed journalism, and usually not for the worse. And now we have, as it was said at the beginning, a new spectre haunting our industry: artificial intelligence. Journalists say that they will be replaced by robots. They worry that the quality will go down, that fake news will proliferate. I don't think that's true. I think, yes, some journalists will be replaced by robots, but not many of them. News will get more personalized, but not always in a bad way. We will still sometimes get hoodwinked by fraudsters and by autocrats, but to be honest, that has always happened. In general, I think AI will help deliver a world where we get more information and more truth. But first, I think we need to be fairly precise about what AI is actually doing. And here I'm going to make no apologies for focusing on Bloomberg a bit. There are lots of organizations, I'll be very clear, who are doing some of the things I'm now going to talk about. But on the whole, I think we tend to be doing slightly more than most. And that's partly a matter of size. We have around 2,700 journalists at Bloomberg, and as we've said, we have an array of platforms from the web to TV to radio and, of course, the terminal. It's partly because we are a technology company. We have 5,000 engineers at Bloomberg, some 200 of them working on AI, not all to do with news. And it's partly, finally, because news is unbelievably valuable to us in a way that it perhaps is more valuable to us than anyone else. If you want an example, in 2015, and this was shortly before I arrived, so I can claim no credit, when the Swiss central bank dropped its peg to the euro, our reporter in Zurich spotted it, while his opposite number at our main rival happened to be on the loo, according to legend. By the time the latter returned to his post, around $1 trillion had changed hands, as the Swiss franc leapt by 30%. There is a reason why people are prepared to buy terminals. So I think there are 4 areas where AI is changing journalism. The first is to do with the automation of repeatable events. When I first arrived at Bloomberg, I met a group of people in what was called the Speed Team. And this was largely a group of nimble-fingered, largely young journalists who could produce headlines very, very quickly about something like the results of Siemens. They knew it was coming up, they would prepare things, and they would hope those headlines would come out a few seconds before that of our competitors. And then shortly afterwards, say 30 minutes, a beat reporter would come back and write a longer piece saying, this is the reason why Siemens did this is why they did that, perhaps add a quote from an analyst at the end. Now what happens, 3-4 years later, is a technology called Cyborg scrapes the earnings from Siemens' website and then spits out headlines and a bullet-pointed story. And the honest answer is that that first version is very close to what somebody would have done in the 30-minute story when I first began, minus, of course, the quote from the analyst. And the computer keeps on doing more. It is not just looking for earnings and comparing those to estimates. It will go and look and see whether the number of turbines sold in China has gone down or up, if that matters to Siemens' share price. Today, 30% of the total content that we do at Bloomberg has some element of automation. But it is really worth stressing that word some. We need journalists to tell Cyborg what to look for at Siemens, to set up the templates the night before that tell the computer where to go. We also need humans to double-check what comes out, both for accuracy and also to look for the key thing that often makes a big difference. What happens if the CEO has resigned? We can't afford to be wrong. So a lot of this is, in fact, semi-automated. All those dreams which some people had of machines doing this, that has not happened. It tends to be humans and machines working together. And the main gain has come in the breadth of speed of what we can do. We can now write earnings reports on many more thousands of companies because that is what the computer helps us do quicker, and we can do it in many more languages. As for the beat reporter, that guy or that woman who used to come in later and write the story, the interesting thing is it ups the ante. All the information is out there already. So you have to say something about what those results actually mean. What was the point? Or you have to go forward and break some new form of news. Now, the interesting thing is in finance, this is a bit of an arms race, with us all spending a lot of money on it, and also with hedge funds and people like that looking at it. But you can see automation, I think, creeping into other forms of journalism. We had a piece the other day about a small newspaper on the south coast of Britain, not rich at all, but uses the same sort of tactics, pulling information from local feeds for traffic and weather. You can see it a bit in sports reporting as well. The second area I'm going to describe where AI is making a difference is on the craft of journalism. This sounds rather small, but it can save a lot of time. Every reporter who has ever taken a recorder to an interview has the horrible problem of transcribing it afterwards. Now, with voice recognition technology, you can do that in a matter of seconds. It saves time. In our business, one big thing is to sit on the telephone and listen to briefing calls from chairs and from CEOs. Only one journalist can do that at a time, but a computer can listen to several briefing calls and highlight when something dramatic happens. It can listen for particular words. For me, and this may be a very relevant point in Germany, automatic translation is also becoming a big game changer. In many places, people report in one language, but then write in another. Now the machine can translate. In Turkey, for instance, our reporters break news in whatever language they find most comfortable with, and then they let the computer mostly translate it. I say mostly again because we still think it's worth showing the final version to a human in many languages. And there are some languages which are easy. Spanish, English has gone a long way ahead. German, to be honest, is harder. But again, you can just see this is coming towards us. The first versions, my deputy is a Swiss German and extremely snooty about the way that machines translate German. And it's true, they make mistakes. When you talk about the ties between companies, they will talk about the ties around your neck. But first time they make that mistake, the second time they don't. So in general, it goes forward. So the craft of journalism is also getting easier. So automated stories, the craft of journalism, those two are well underway. But I would argue there are two other areas where AI is opening up things which are going to be much bigger. The first is signaling. Here the machine tells you something. It says, look, here is a piece of news, a piece of information. Do you want to write a story about it? For instance, we have a unit at Bloomberg called Social Velocity. And what it is a relatively small number of journalists with a large number of computers. And what they do is they scour social media around the world, looking, and I apologize for the grisly nature of this, for words like disaster, explosion, shooting, resignation, because most of the news about those things occurs first in Twitter feeds and social media and places like that. So the computer can find those things, but then it is up to the journalist to verify it, to tell whether it is accurate or not. Has this person really resigned? Can we trust this source? And interestingly, so far, we are pretty good at verifying information in this way, but it is much harder on the whole to verify video. To give you an example, last year there was a shooting sadly at a New York subway. We were very quickly managed to verify that that had happened, but at the same time, rather ghastly images were circulating on social media of what was purported to be a dead terrorist lying in a pool of blood. That was much harder to verify. Can you check that the subway floor looks like that? Can you adapt the number of pixels to check that no one has checked it? We are slower at that, but we will get better as we have at the original thing. Another version of signaling does not begin with a piece of news per se. It begins with data. The machine can say, look, the GDP of Germany is rising 5 times faster than the UK since Brexit. Do you want to write a story about that? Or it can point out that 3 directors of a company in Bavaria have just sold shares in their company. Do you want to write about it? Or in football, you can already see they will point towards the Bundesliga and point out that one player has produced more crosses than any other player. Does that make a difference? And so on and so on. The machine is asking us that basic question. And to that extent, I think the machine is taking on the job, to some extent, of a commissioning editor. Rather than the editor saying, do you want to write a story about this, the machine is saying it. But the interesting thing as well is it gives editors a way of holding journalists to account. Imagine that a local reporter here has been prompted that Commerzbank's shares have jumped by 5%, and it is asked the basic story, she is asked the basic idea, do you want to write about this? And she decides no. Well, if that turns out, and obviously this is all make-believe, turns out to be the first stage of a takeover by Deutsche Bank, well, then people have the right to come back and say, well, why didn't you do this? And that, I think, increases accountability. The fourth and biggest way in which I think AI could affect what we do will be the issue of personalization. And this, I think, is the holy grail of journalism. It's a bit like the old advertising joke. We know that half our advertising works, we just don't know which half it is. And the same, I think, goes for journalism. Readers waste a lot of time, or as they see it, reading stuff they don't want. And so far as an industry, we have not been good at correcting this and improving it. Readers hate filling out forms on the internet listing what their interests are, and they love serendipity. They love looking at a newspaper and seeing a headline about Angela Merkel at the top, and then finding a story at the bottom about the Queen telling off Prince Philip about his driving record. You could argue those are just 2 powerful German women extending their display, but still, people love the idea of jumping from one story to the other. Now, at Bloomberg, again, we have a slight advantage on this, because on the terminal, we have people, we know which securities they own, we know what they have looked at recently, or the machine goes, and they don't mind being targeted in a way that people find awkward on the consumer side. And so I'll give you 2 examples of the sort of ways in which I think journalism will change. The first is a thing we do, which is a scrolling news service called First Word. Already, we have targeted that at 40, 50 player types. So if you're an equity salesman, you get a different scrolling news service than if you're a commodities trader. Now we're looking at dividing them further. So far, we have used humans to curate the different channels, but if we end up with 300, that will get harder, and we may have to go backwards and forwards. This is a field where computers learn from editors, editors learn from computers, and so it goes on. The second example of personalization, which I would argue is as close to a personalized newspaper as you can find in the world, is again just on the terminal, but it's called Daybreak. It's delivered to your phone first thing in the morning, and what it comes in is three sections, and I think this is the way that newspapers will go in the future. The first is called Need to Know, and it gives you the general news, i.e. what has happened in politics, what has happened in the markets. The second is called Your News, and that is where the personalization comes in. It deals with the companies that you have shares in. It deals with the countries that you have said you are interested in. And the last bit is Nice to Know, which is where you discover the stories about Prince Philip. That is the serendipity part. Consumer sites tend to find this harder. At Bloomberg.com, you can set up your own share portfolio, and we will alert you about that. And we also do emails in the morning called the Bloomberg Open and the Bloomberg Close. And we're adding ever more regions like that. My guess, and it is only a guess, is that in the consumer media, the way in which people will personalize beyond anything else is emails and newsletters in particular. It is much more convenient to get news pushed to you rather than you going off to go and find it. And everybody looks at their email in the morning. And yes, I think we can personalize these things without creating echo chambers. So those are the four basic ways in which I think AI is changing journalism. Again, I'm not claiming that Bloomberg has a monopoly in any of them, but I do think we're probably as advanced as anyone else is in this. And I think there are some general trends underneath this that apply to journalism of all sorts. The first is on the human side of journalism, and it is a move from what I would call the what to why and what's next. The what has something what has just happened. That is staggeringly valuable, and we know that better than anybody else. That is staggeringly valuable, as it has always been, but for an ever shorter period. News hurtles around the world in seconds, and you can see that already in share prices. And that's why the why and what's next matter more. The more robots and computers help with the humdrum side of news, the more the value changes to real reporting and analysis. We think at Bloomberg that we break more news about which companies are going to merge around the world than any other news service. That does not come from computers. That comes from people wearing out shoe leather, talking to people. Same on analysis. You cannot automate Martin Wolf of the FT. You can't automate the journalists of The Economist or The Atlantic. And editors also matter. The danger with automation is spam, is sending too much automated news that people don't like. One thing that we discovered back at The Economist is that what you leave out is as important as what you put in. All our readers have been hit by the fire hose of the internet. Machines can litter a news service with headlines, and readers don't like it. So again, editing matters. Next, I think AI will help reformat news. In the old days, if you looked at a story in, say, the New York Times, the news story looked pretty much the same. It would be roughly the same length and roughly the same thing. If you wanted to read the New York Times piece on Margaret Thatcher, you had to read the entire thing. Now, obviously, we have blogs, you have videos, you have all the different versions of what you can do. When longer stories are now broken up with links and explainers. It's interesting, again, at Bloomberg, we've adapted some stories to what we call an update format. If you look at Brexit, you have to cater for two audiences. One is the audience who knows everything about it and just wants to know exactly what the latest development is. And the second is the people who don't know so much and where you have to add explainers, you have to add things around it. But the idea of the linear narrative is going to get ever harder, and AI is going to play part in that. In general, I'll be honest, the trend is towards quicker and shorter formats, but not always. This is about the efficient use of readers' time. And in many cases, it is still more efficient to read one long piece in the New Yorker about, say, Syria, than it is to read 25 shorter pieces, a lot of blogs and video graphics. What about, finally, that subject of fake news? Will AI make it easier to fool us? We can all remember the cyber-utopianism of the early 1990s when people dreamt about citizen journalism making us all purer. That went the same way as those dreams about delivering news for free. Now we know, and it's very clear, that the same technology that was supposed to democratize the world can be used to suppress dissent. It may be unnerving to some that China is ahead in some versions of AI, such as face recognition technology. And yes, it is very obvious the new tech can be used to distort and fool people very easily. If you look at some of the claims in American courts, it seems that the last American election it was possible to fix it from a Moscow office building for a cost of just $1 million a month. So fake news has changed also thanks to AI. Rather than broadcasting one big lie, you tend to narrowcast lots of small ones with the idea of spreading doubt, so that the fact that Russian separatists in Ukraine shot down an airliner gets questioned in lots of small ways. So all those things are there, but don't forget all the different ways in which AI will help journalists find things. You can scour the Panama Papers in seconds with the help of a computer. You can check whether the picture of a man on the right really is Donald Trump. And it will help us disseminate news. As the Washington Post says on its masthead, democracy dies in darkness. AI, I think, in the end, helps us shed more light by getting more news to more people. It is harder for people to hide. And go back to what I said at the beginning, the humility that comes from having got it wrong. Fake news did not begin with the internet. If you think about it, the Trojan horse was arguably the original piece of fake news, though you could say it was the apple in the Garden of Eden. Go back to ancient Rome. Octavian poisoned the people of Rome's minds about Mark Antony by publishing a fake will of his rival in which he left all his money to Egypt. Shakespeare made a villain out of Richard III. And think of those wonderful official newspapers in what was East Germany. The only people who really believed Neues Deutschland was Jeremy Corbyn. Journalism was always interrupted by technology. In 1814, the Times of London started using a steam-powered press that effectively meant you could multiply the amount of pages you published tenfold. Cheap newspapers, you look around the world, around the West, they multiplied. Many of them scandalous, many of them hopelessly untruthful. The biggest was Benjamin Day's New York Sun, which sold for a penny, a fraction of its competitors. It specialized in extravagant fake news. It reported that half bat, half human mutants were living on the moon. And when people questioned Day about this, he said, "Prove him wrong." But gradually the tide turned. Newspapers changed for two reasons. First, advertisers decided they did not want to promote their brands alongside obvious rubbish like the half-bat, half-human stories. And secondly, readers, just as they are today, began to pay for good content. That is how you ended up with the New York Times and The Economist and many of Germany's biggest newspapers. I think the same goes for the age of AI. People will migrate to brands that they trust, and we at Bloomberg hope we will be one of them. Thank you very much.